Well, let's bring in Sam Amick as all guests are coming to you via the Fire Wings hotline. Try one of their delicious flavors of wings today. Fire Wings, just wing it. We welcome in this morning and say Happy New Year to Sam Amick. Sam, how are you?
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm doing good. We're going to have to wing it. We've got the old winter cold voice coming at you, but doing fine otherwise. Thank you.
Sounds good. Sounds nice, and there's a lot to it there, Sam.
Sam, I'm sure we could do a 3-hour podcast and still have a ton of material on David Stern to get to, but I'll start with this. What was your, I don't want to, for lack of a better term, it doesn't have to be exact, Sam, but scariest encounter or scariest moment with David, the intimidator of all intimidators?
So I don't have like a, kind of super frightening one. It's more a combination of like his edge and a moment that, to be honest, he at the time with them. 2010, I go to the LA All-Star Weekend, and the context matters a lot. So job-wise, as you guys remember, I worked at AOL Fan House, the short-lived website that at the time had already decided to close its doors, and you had about 100 sports writers who were unofficially out of work already, but Fan House still paying for us to go to All-Star Weekend. So like any other smart person would, I was both covering All-Star Weekend, but because the site was about to die, I was also trying to get my next job. And so I go to a All-Star Weekend event, and I try to track down David Stern because, getting him before his media-wide press conference would be a nice little scoop to help me with my challenges. And I get David with one other reporter. Chris Thomason was working with me at the time also. So you have two unofficially unemployed sports writers talking to David Stern. And we say to David, David, what are you thinking about on the horizon? The league that you've built. And if anybody listening doesn't know, the expression, the fourth estate, is just a fancy way of saying the media. And so we ask a very softball question. David, what kind of changes are you thinking for the NBA? And this kind of speaks to his eternal sarcasm. He looks at us both and says, less employment for the fourth estate. And at the time, it's hilarious now. You too, DJ. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. But like he was always cunning, but he was kind as well. He had both sides. And I did enjoy getting to know him better through the Sacramento situation. And then, honestly, guys, once he retired, it was really a joy to run into him because he wouldn't have any of that baggage. I saw him, and that would kind of make him tougher to interact with. I saw him in Utah one time during the playoff, and had a really nice conversation, and then talked to him on the phone just a month ago about the King saga. So just a massive loss.
We're breaking up here a little bit.
We are
breaking
Sam,
up
a little bit, Sam.
I want to ask about that part of him because all we see is press conferences, stuff he has led charges on crisis, on renovation, on innovation, on promising things for the league. So once he retired, what was that conversation like, him as a man? Like that part, I'm very intrigued about David Stern.
So it was only a couple of times after the retirement, but in Salt Lake City, it was Jazz Rockets. So I think 2 years ago, and I actually was kind of running around with Steve Starks, the Jazz business president. He was showing me a few things around the building. And next thing you know, he was bringing me in to talk to and say hello to Gail Miller, the owner of the Jazz and the wife of the late Larry Miller. And Gail was just sitting and having basically a pregame dinner with David, and I didn't even know David was there. And not to like project too much and pretend I could read his mind, but he did seem to have this kind of energy where it was like, he would never admit it. He loved the media. Like he knew the part that the media played. And so like when he and I saw each other, I think I was in that crew that was constantly chasing him during the 2010 lockouts. And so it was like, we had those experiences. I was certainly in that crew that was chasing him on the Sacramento-Seattle story. And so when I saw him in Salt Lake City, I mean, I don't remember all the specifics of our talk, but it was very much, kind of affectionate and warm. And on his part, you could tell that, that he didn't have those interactions as often anymore with the media. He just seemed to be in a good place. His hair was a little longer, but other than that, he was, the same guy, and his work had been done professionally.
Sam Amick joining us from The Athletic. Sam, I'm going to ask you a tough one here because I'm seeing a lot of retrospectives and, the highs and lows and mostly highs of David Stern's career. What do you, you're guessing, but what do you think David Stern would say the highlight of his tenure as commissioner would be? What do you think he was most proud of?
I think he would find a way to push that conversation toward I talked about this yesterday on a podcast with the great David Aldridge, who's at our place, and he'd push it towards the soul of the NBA and the fact that, it's not easy to take it from a mom and pop shop, so to speak, to a company that has an $8 billion annual revenue, income, and still have a soul. You know what I mean? So whether it's the handling of Magic Johnson's HIV news, which, younger people, and I was barely old enough I don't remember it in real time, but, now that they thought Magic was going to die.
Yeah. And
then the NBA had to, but more importantly, it's one thing if you think a guy's going to die because he was in a car accident, he had a disease that everybody thought was not only fatal, but that was a reflection of homosexuality, and people it was hands off, and players were scared. Nobody wanted to play with him. He might touch me. He might get blood on me. And David went to work destigmatizing. Sorry, can't get that one out.
Right.
HIV, and he educated himself. He hired experts because he was humble enough to know what he didn't know. And then when Magic, and I talked, this is always a fun name drop. I talked to Jerry West yesterday about David, and he said, well, Magic pushed really hard to be in the All-Star game that year, but David could have shut it down, and he didn't. So, that's the best example of his kind of attempt to be a human in that position as commissioner of the NBA. But there were plenty of other examples. You know what I mean? It was it's a league where they have been progressive on social issues, and they have, they've got, 85+% African American players. And that came with, I think, a ton of responsibility for David to set the tone, because he knew that culturally, the way that this league functioned was going to an extent, set the tone for, at least a part of society. And I think, by and large, he did a wonderful job on that front.
Do you think, Sam, that he shined better in the highs or the lows, of his position when it's, it's fun to brag about expansion and TV deals and creating a women's league and all the growth and prosperity, but there's the malice in the palace. There's a bunch of negative things that you have to go through as the man in charge as well. Where do you think he shined better, in the highs or the lows?
Good question, Jay. It probably shined better in the highs. I can't think of, the lows were tricky because, for one, it takes a special personality to just consistently light people up in a group setting like David was notorious for doing, and to still have people speak kindly of you, meaning like Board of Governors meetings. He was legendary for, he would embarrass you in front of the group. He would, there was a little bit of that in the media too. If you didn't ask a good question, he would say it was a dumb question. And he was cutting, and there was a lot of that. Even in the story I wrote yesterday, it had a quote from him about when they were trying to get the Kings sale over the finish line. He had to kind of grab George Maloof and kind of shake him and say, this is your last deal. And his style was very abrasive, yet people, still speak fondly of him. And that was even before he passed away. But, the lows, it's interesting. I don't have a ton of recollections or clarity on, the Seattle one would be the only one that does come to mind for me. He was until his dying day, I'm confident saying, stood by his choice to not only keep the Kings in Sacramento, but, in terms of the blame game, he would point directly at the politicians in Seattle back, when they were losing the team to Oklahoma City. Ultimately, their inability to get a new arena done, the politics that happened there, he put the blame at their feet and said the way they handled it was what led to what ended up ultimately happening. The one that doesn't get talked about a lot, I don't know how his reflections might have been, was, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf was suspended by the NBA for not standing for the national anthem. That's a black mark. And I don't know.
The dress code, I was trying to think. Yeah.
I mean, the dress code is another one for sure. But then over time, not trying to connect dots that don't exist, but over time, when you have the legends of the game in terms of players and even guys who played through the dress code era, ultimately acting as if, not enough foresight on the league's part at that time to see the implications that came with the dress code. But you didn't hear people running around saying, again, before he passed, saying, why does David Stern get celebrated?
Right.
The dress code was like, they seemed to, by and large, say forgive him or whatever you want to say. I mean, that wasn't a great one either. Newsflash, he was human, and certainly not every move he made was the right one. But by and large, again, he got it right.
Sam Amick joining us on the drive. Sam, we talk about David Stern, and we've hit on it a little bit, but you know what city you're on in, and David Stern has I don't know that there's another city that David Stern has this type of relationship with, as special and almost universally beloved as he is here. That's the name of the where the Golden One Center stands right now. We say it in passing, the Kings wouldn't be here without David Stern, but I want you to expand on that. I mean, when we say the Kings would not be here without David Stern, I feel like of all the heroes and people that stepped up, from KJ to the ownership to the fans, that's all fun and games without David.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is, excuse me, you have to cut through the entire saga, the ups and downs, and, Virginia Beach and Anaheim and Seattle and everything in between. It reached a point where, in order for the Kings to stay in Sacramento, a certain number of owners had to vote on the Kings to stay in Sacramento, or more specifically, to not relocate to Seattle, as was petitioned. And for me, one of the main takeaways is just that's the first time that I learned about how the NBA, truly learned about how the NBA functions differently than I had thought previously. A conventional American business, in my my experience, everything came down to follow the money. And not to say the NBA doesn't chase money like everybody else. They obviously do, but Seattle represented more money. The Maloofs had already been given that substantial deposit that was non-refundable by Chris Hansen and Steve Ballmer in order to, I thought at the time, to make an attempt to game the system. And Chris Hansen in particular, I still think, made mistakes when it comes to his belief that the combination of more cash than everybody else, and then getting into bed with the Maloofs in the kind of way that he did without looping in the NBA or David Stern at every step along the way, was a fatal mistake for his pursuit of the Kings, because the Sacramento side had done the exact opposite. They did not have their money in order because they didn't know. They knew there were threats, but they didn't have this ownership group ready. What they did have was, people like Kevin Johnson, who had relationships with David and who essentially followed his blueprint. And I said yesterday on this podcast with David Aldridge that Stern had stepped up, put his thumb on the scale during this thing, and he laughed, and he's just like, Sammy, he put his whole entire frame on that scale when it comes to the way this thing worked. He was helping Kevin and the Kings follow the rules, rally the owners. And again, Kevin does deserve a ton of credit. That one Board of Governors meeting in New York, when I'll never forget talking to him on the court at Arco, off the record, and just kind of shrugging and saying, this thing's a wrap, right? Like, you guys, I don't see how you come back from this. And he kind of grinned and he literally said, "I got this." And he goes out to New York, and he had to. It wasn't about like win one for the Gipper speech. It was about telling owners about sponsorships, telling them about the business and how you could create enough revenue streams in Sacramento combined with fan support to justify keeping the team. But the part that David did in the end was that he was a puppet master with the owners, and they had seen how much he grew this league, and they had ultimate faith in him. And if David told you that the best thing for the league was to keep the team in Sacramento, then for the most part, the majority said okay, and they did it. And I mean, that's why the team is here.
Yeah, and Sam, that's so well said. Dave and I were trying to figure out, I mean, like to the core, why he would want that. Because like you said, follow the money. You could make so many cases that it would have made more sense for this team to go to Seattle, but it always seemed like he had, for lack of a better term, a rooting interest in keeping this team here. And if he had all the power, as you suggest he did, and the influence, that was telling. But just the reason he wanted them here is still kind of a curious one for me.
Well, I think so. The heart of the league, they claim, and I'm not trying to put quotations around claim, was that they, for one, they were very anti-relocation. I think in general they just thought relocation was bad for business. I can't read the man's mind. I'm going to guess and say he was probably somewhat stung. And again, the ironic part is stung by the backlash over the Oklahoma City move. And the fact that just in terms of the concept of relocation, that story reflected poorly upon the NBA, and you now had an entire city that just, whether they were Sonics fans or just NBA fans, you had a whole city that was a little bit toxic in relation to the NBA because of what had happened. Now, certainly, it's common sense to say, well, why wouldn't you fix that blight and give them the Kings? I just don't think he saw it that way. I think he then thinks that Sacramento would have been an anti-NBA part of the country. I also wonder to what degree David, whether it was New Orleans, which he fought to keep the team there when it did not make business sense and probably still doesn't, or Sacramento, that I think he was on, the selfish part might have been pushing back against the narrative that still exists, that he was somebody who just was trying to funnel all the best talent and all the cash to all the big cities, and even was a little surprised yesterday, ESPN's obituary on him was really heavy on that angle. And it was true. I mean, in terms of, let's not be naive here. New York, LA, Chicago, if they're doing well, the league's doing well. But he spent a lot of his time as commissioner also trying to balance it the other way. And I think, there's probably a reason for that. I think he didn't necessarily like that narrative.
We're out of time, Sam, but I got to ask you, when he announced the final vote to keep the team in Sacramento, I've always wondered this, and I don't think I've asked you. He got to the podium. He said, "We got to make it quick. I have a plane to catch to Oklahoma City." Do you think he did that on purpose?
I wish I don't know, but when we talked last month, he actually brought that up, but it was in a very innocent kind of way. Like I think I told people I had to go to Oklahoma City, and I took a little flack for that.
Yeah, and I always wondered: was it a kindly old man making a mistake, or was it David Stern knowing exactly what he's doing at all times?
No, he always knows what he's doing. Yeah, the dude was brilliant. So he, again, incredible career, incredible life, and I appreciate you guys letting me kind of reflect on it a little bit.
No, it was great for us to get this insight from you.
David Aldridge's podcast.
I know.
But thanks for coming on. Jeez.
Sorry.
My God.
DA, he's a legend.
I know.
He's another legend.
I know.
Yeah.
He's a good guy.
Well,
right.
Sam, happy New Year. We look forward to talking to you again next week.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Happy New Year.
All right.
Too.
The Drive.